Welcome to the Interlocutor, episode 3 with me, Anthony Anaxagorou. Today I'm joined by Louis Cariolis. Louis completed his PhD in law at the University of Oxford. His PhD analysed the protection of human rights by the European Court of Justice. He teaches law and public policy at Oxford School of Government. He was formerly a researcher in law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His parents are refugees from Cyprus and he was born in London. Louis, good evening, how are you?
Very good.
So I think the first thing that I want to look at in this episode is the Brexit campaign and how that affected people within the UK. Do you feel that the population were generally misled?
Well, it's a tricky question. The inference that people were misled, if they were, it stems from the dissemination of misrepresentations about the EU from the Leave camp, but also a failure to rectify these misrepresentations by the Remain camp, which leads me to conclude that perhaps neither side fully understood the nature and function of the EU, let alone the consequences of Britain leaving the EU. And the net result of that is that it's very difficult for the electorate to ascertain whether it's worth being part of this somewhat amorphous supranational entity.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about, one of the main things outside of obviously the immigration hysteria was this idea of democracy. And I remember we spoke a few months ago when all this was going on, and you said to me how technically the EU is more democratic than Westminster and the way that we are set up here. Is this true? Is this something that should be known by people?
Yeah, the issue of power is something which wasn't really discussed in the debates, I don't think. So people were quite surprised by my position. I was actually in favour of Britain staying in the EU. I am quite left-leaning, so people thought it's strange. A lot of people conceptualise the EU as some kind of neoliberal, this idea of being bastion. It's an internal market. It's primarily about economics, about free movement of goods and services. But there is absolutely a left-wing case for actually being part of the EU. But from the position of power, what people think of the EU is this kind of hierarchical power which is lording over all of the member states. But actually, the way to properly look at it is that all member states cede a degree of power to this overarching power. So what it actually does is fragment power. So now what happens is if Britain leaves the EU, then power will be condensed in Westminster now. And if you are left-wing, then that essentially means that you're going to have a Tory government with unchecked power to an extent, because leaving the EU also means there's a protection of rights. There's an EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which will no longer apply if Britain leaves the EU. You have the European Court of Justice, which is entrusted to ensure the protection of human rights. So that's one layer of protection, and it also emboldens governments to go even further. Now, what I mean by that is the Conservative government would ideally like to repeal the Human Rights Act. Now, the Human Rights Act incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, strictly speaking, the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter are two different things, but nevertheless, you get where I'm going with this. It's going to be going back to this archaic going back to this idea of a nation state, whereas right now you could actually conceptualize Britain as a province of the EU.
And if we were to think about the way in which both campaigns, particularly the Leave campaign, was led, like we said at the beginning, the fear-mongering, the hysteria, the misinformation that was being disseminated through the media and through various populist politicians, we need to also consider the fact that we live in an age where fact itself is not valued in the way that it might have been 50 years ago. There is a difference between the truth and the fact. How important is information when it comes to something like this, and why is it culturally have we accepted now this post-fact method of absorbing information where we're not as critical with the source that this information is coming from? Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think the source of that is the proliferation of media. So you have so many news outlets, and whereas before you'd have, well, actually paradoxically, a lot of that media is actually controlled by the same people.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's diverse, but actually it's governed by the same few people. But I think there's such a proliferation of media now. People are being bombarded with information, and it's so fast paced that it becomes very difficult to check the validity of that information.
Do you think that also that there is an element of sensationalism, that we don't actually want rigorous journalism anymore? What we're looking for is something superficial, something exciting, something that is based around spectacle. And I think that if you look at Farage, and we're going to get to Trump in a minute, but just looking at Farage and how he kind of conducts himself, and even Boris Johnson to an extent, there is a showmanship that is centred around that. And I've always thought about, why is it culturally that is now permissible, or has it always been permissible?
I mean, it's difficult to give a disquisition on that kind of thing. But what I do think, there is some guilt which could be attributed to public intellectuals or academics who realistically quite easily, quite a junior academic could come out and dispel many of the misconceptions which were put out there by Farage, or actually if they wanted to stay, they could have joined the Remain camp and actually said, actually what they're doing here is you're conflating EU migration with external migration, or you're confusing the European Court of Human Rights with the European Court of Justice, which are two distinct courts. Now, so for instance, in the Daily Mail, typically if the European Court of Human Rights makes a decision, the Daily Mail will just call it the European Court as shorthand, and people think it's the European Court of Justice, which belongs to the EU. So people, there's this sentiment of, here's the EU constantly encroaching on our powers.
If we now think about how Brexit and the rise and the accession of someone like Donald Trump, what are the parallels between both of these two movements?
There definitely are parallels. I think it's important not to conflate too much. But what I do think, populism being the obvious one, and we've already touched on the post-fact era that we're living in, the reality is you can almost, once you've said something and it's out in the public domain, whether it's actually true or not, you could just say, I'm the cleverest man in London.
Yeah.
Once it's actually out there, how do you check that?
Yeah.
So I think that plays into it. But I think also there are echo chambers, basically. I think this is what, for me, the election of Trump and the subsequent response to him shows, that many people are not conscious of how you log on to Facebook and you see people with similar views to you, but that actually isn't necessarily reflective of what's going on in the wider world.
Sure.
So I think that is an interesting part of it.
The idea of echo chambers, the idea of not wanting to kind of go into information in a detailed way, again, could leak back into this notion that we as a people now are not necessarily concerned with factual information. We're more concerned with things, like we said before, that are just exciting. I'm wondering now, even amongst the American electorate, 49% of the electorate didn't actually turn out to vote for Trump. How is it that, is it really a matter of the dispossessed? Did Trump speak to a portion of America that were not concerned with any of these things that he was saying being true? They was just concerned with the fact that they had somebody representing them. Was he talking to them, or was it something much more insidious, much more profound?
Well, I think it's undeniable that people, both with regards to Brexit and America, felt that with regards to Brexit, they haven't been beneficiaries of being part of the EU. And in America, they haven't been beneficiaries of, neoliberalism, which is kind of bizarre, because if you think about it, Trump is more right-wing. He's a Republican. So you're going to have capitalism on steroids now under his watch. So I think there is that sense that, we haven't really benefited from, despite the promise of Obama and Hillary Clinton. And actually, the point I'd like to make here is that I found the reporting of the election in America and Brexit to be very binary and glib. And what I mean by that is I feel, I don't know if you agree with me, that there was a romanticization of Hillary Clinton and a demonization of Trump. Now, I think that's intellectually dishonest, at least with regards to Hillary Clinton. because her track record wasn't fantastic, and her policies are really a continuation. They're neoliberal policies which are a continuation of Obama's, and he himself took the blueprint from Bill Clinton, so it's all rather incestuous from that point of view. But the election of Trump isn't necessarily a bad thing, and here I subscribe to the kind of dialectical method and something which has been espoused by Slavoj Žižek, and I know you have your concerns about this view.
Yeah.
But the point is this: in opposition to Trump, a more authentic challenge or a more authentic left can emerge. So the point I said earlier is that if Hillary Clinton is a continuation of the neoliberal policies, then people would say, okay, she's hierarchically subordinate to Barack Obama in that she's less polished and probably has less zest, but she would only be subjected to a mild critique. And whatever, she's not great, but she would pass through. But with Trump, he does stir up the pot, if you like.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I find quite uncomfortable is this idea of reinvigorating the left in all its facets. Like we saw the interview with Zizek and Mehdi Hasan, and they were talking in this real. For me, Zizek was coming across in a very abstract way, and I think in theory, sure, it would work, but the kind of counter argument to that is at what expense? At the expense of people of colour, at the expense of refugees, at the expense of gay people, of the people that Donald Trump is just not representative of. So I think these arguments, there definitely has to be some kind of reshuffling within the left and the right and the centre. But then at the same time, it has to work in a way that is beneficial for everyone. And I think that having Donald Trump there as at the helm of a country that is, founded on war, founded on genocide, founded on oppressing its own people, is a very problematic thing.
But to some extent, I feel Hillary Clinton is the opposite side of the same coin when it comes to Trump. And if you're talking about alleviating the plight of the poor or of African Americans, well, Obama rode in promising to do many of these things. Did he really deliver? He was very polished, he was very well spoken, but did he alleviate the plight of the poor? Is Guantanamo Bay still open? If anything, he exacerbated wars in certain areas.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, internationally, he was terrible.
Sure, and I mean, Hillary Clinton, in terms of security, she was a neocon. She, her participation in Syria, her views of Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. She certainly wouldn't forge any alliance with Russia, which some people might think is good or bad. But I certainly didn't have much confidence from a security standpoint with Hillary Clinton. So that's all I don't mean in any way, shape or form that Trump is good, but I'm saying it could provide an opportunity for a more reinvigorated social justice approach to America.
How do you distinguish between some of these terms? The idea of a libertarian, the idea of a socialist. How do you differentiate between? I mean, sometimes they're used interchangeably. Some people have problems with defining what each one means. For you, how do they work?
This is really interesting. I think recently these are amorphous terms, and people conflate them a lot. And what I find quite interesting is that the right, or the alt-right, they're called in America, they keep attacking what they're calling the left or the liberal left, but that's actually amalgamating liberalism and socialism, where I think you do have to draw a lucid distinction between the two. So they're actually attacking liberals. I think the Democratic Party's shorthand for liberalism right now is definitely not what I'd classify as socialism. The socialist candidate was Bernie Sanders. The socialist candidate, or the Democratic socialist candidate in England, would be Jeremy Corbyn. So I think the left here one thing the left and the right seem to have in common is almost a bit of a disdain towards liberals and their reaction to it. But going back to, in terms of classical liberalism, I think I would say that the difference between liberalism and socialism is that a fundamental tenet of socialism is the idea of collective responsibility rather than the pursuit of individual goals, whereas liberalism is about creating an institutional framework within which one can pursue their individual goals. So the state intervenes, but only to the extent of providing a free market, respect for the rule of law, all these kind of sacred values. Doesn't mean that democratic socialism can't have these either. Yeah.
Is there something within the left that I mean, obviously, I regard myself as a socialist, and one of the things that I've observed over the years is seeing how quick the left are to take down other members of the left. And whenever anything happens, it always seems to be within these socialist left-wing movements that all the chastising and the lambasting starts to take place. Is it within our personality as people who are more plural to want to be that critical of everything to the point they become critical of people on their own side?
I think perhaps it stems from this intellectual curiosity and a critical approach to seeing things. So it's ecumenical, as you say, but people then, I think it was you who said once, the difference between the left and the right is that the left would agree on 90% of things and bicker over the 10%, whereas conservatives would unite over the 10%
and have a drink
and never mind the 90% that they disagree with. Yeah. So I think that is true.
Yeah, I've always found it as a very counterproductive, actually quite a frustrating thing as well. I think it was Owen Jones that said maybe last year or the year before how we're not so much bounded by left and right, we're more bounded by policy, and there's certain policies that you might agree with, even if it comes from the alt-right or whatever it might be. And I think that is, for me, what I saw with Brexit was it was this cross-party pollination that was happening, that you had people from different, the antithesis of each other's political ideas and meeting in the middle. You had Cameron and Corbyn on the same side, everywhere outside of that, these guys were against each other ideologically. How do you feel that fits in, and how are we able to adjust and kind of, when it comes down to matters like Brexit or like Trump, do we have the ability to come together and overthrow or oppose these kind of ideas?
Well, I think the reality is that the picture which has been delineated by elites or politicians is going back to your early point, is not a reality that people necessarily recognize. So, for instance, working class people in America wouldn't necessarily understand or have much sympathy towards ideas of safe space or positive discrimination or some of these, kind of what you'd classify as, pejoratively, it's been called social justice, if you like. So I think there is a dissonance between what's going on at the ground level and a perception of the world which is articulated in the media, in the academy as well. So I think what is needed is for politicians to more accurately reflect what's going on, for people working 9 to 5 who don't have time to tap into these narratives.
I mean, moving on from this, staying kind of within this subject area, one of the things that a lot of when I do work in schools, young people often associate themselves as working class or upper working class or lower working class. I've always found class out of all the isms to be the most confusing, in the sense of, where do we draw the line? What distinguishes you between another member of society as being of another class? Is it your culture? Is it your disposable income? Is it the football team you support, the area that you live in? Is it your job? How do you see class? How do you see those distinctions? How do you draw the lines?
Well, class has a peculiarly British feel to it. Now, I think a fundamental difference between America, for instance, and England is that I feel that in England, irrespective of how far you get sometimes in life, it also always comes back to, where did you start? So even if you feel you've progressed up the social ladder, people kind of use your background against you. Whereas in America, it's the polar opposite. If anything, people like to embellish a bit and say, because it's part of the American dream, look, I started with nothing and here I've arrived. So I think there are these two different trajectories going on in England and America. Myself growing up in this country, for me it's always been the most fascinating thing, class, because it's always been this ambivalence that I felt about even myself, being Cypriot, having a decent education, or going even to Cyprus as a young boy, because Cyprus, before it joined the EU, was certainly not, how should we say, capitalism hadn't really arrived at Cyprus's shore. So there was this kind of juxtaposition going on between this kind of capitalist, fast-paced England that I grew up in, and the more serene Cyprus, shall we say. I know
we weren't going to get onto the subject of identity and being part of the diaspora, but how did you find that shift going back to Cyprus as someone who was regarded as being a working class person of colour in England, to go back to Cyprus and to be treated differently, to be called pejorative things when you go back there. I shared the same experience. How did you find that transition?
I think the fact that we're not living there, we cling on to this idea of the motherland a bit, or perhaps romanticize about it. I'd put it like this: I don't feel like I'm English when I'm in England, and then I go to Cyprus, I realise I'm not fully Cypriot either. So there's this. I'm probably ambivalent is the best way to classify our existence, and it becomes even more complicated because there you're looking at nationality, but then you're transcending certain barriers based on the profession that you do as well, the world that you enter into. So all these different things clash and coalesce.
Yeah, and you really do end up leaving with this huge identity crisis. And I've always said, growing up, I've never felt more conflicted about something than the big question of who am I? And the older that you get and the more information you acquire, the more confusing that question actually becomes, and you realise you're actually working away from it as opposed to working towards some kind of answer, because more barriers keep getting put up, more categories, more boxes, and it just becomes unmanageable to an extent. So yeah, I think to put it down as this living in a constant state of ambivalence is probably the best way to kind of look at it.
But I think it's insoluble, and I think what happens is these different experiences become part of who you are. So it reconfigures your identity rather than displaces it. So am I a Cypriot? Am I an Oxford educated guy? I'm all of the above, really. I'm not defined by any of them in particular.
I know that you're quite a big lover of the old philosophy, and we've spent many times pontificating on various different things. I want to talk to you now about analytical and continental philosophy. Where do you sit? Where do you regard yourself? Are you an analytical man or are you a continental man?
Well, I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive, but I suppose it probably makes sense to try and define what the two are first. Analytical philosophy, you could say, has two branches, which is logical positivism and linguistic philosophy, whereas continental philosophy is looking more at theoretical aspects about the world, or trying to look at the reality beneath surface appearance. So logical positivism is a branch of philosophy which established itself in opposition to metaphysics. So metaphysical questions are, what is the nature of being? What does it mean to exist? Is there a God? What is consciousness?
Who am I?
Who am I? The questions that we've just been dwelling on in the past few minutes. So logical positivism is essentially the ruthless application of logic and reason, which is rooted in scientific rationality, and essentially regards metaphysics as bosh, as nonsense, because logical positivism attaches great value to empirically testing the validity of propositions. So this idea of what is God, you cannot ascertain whether God exists. So a logical positivist would say it's a redundant inquiry and you ought not to waste your time.
And am I right in saying that one relies more heavily on science and the other one involves more theory?
Yeah, I mean, well, continental philosophy is definitely more theoretical, but I mean, you can make logical propositions in a metaphysical way. So again, it's not as if you have logic on one side, but continental philosophy has no logic. But I think the analytic philosophers certainly have a degree of disdain towards continental philosophers. And the two, I mean, contrasting two philosophers that we've mentioned, we have Noam Chomsky, who's very much part of the analytical tradition, and Slavoj Žižek, who very much represents this kind of obscure continental side.
Yeah, no, and with Žižek and Bertrand Russell, who was obviously a very famous analytical philosopher, it's interesting to see the trajectory that they've kind of taken, particularly with Žižek over the past maybe 5 years. And you saw him talk at the South Bank, and I remember you saying that you were underwhelmed by how nebulous and how muddy his thinking had become, almost this overly caffeinated philosopher who seemed to be just talking in riddles a lot of the time. I think last week I saw Noam Chomsky talk, and the man's I think he just turned 88, and the clarity, how lucid his thinking was, his precision of language was absolutely unparalleled. And I think of Zizek, who is saying absolutely absurd and ridiculous things at the moment. What do you think has resulted in this shift in Zizek's thinking?
I think maybe he's seeking to provoke. It seems that he's on a bit of a self-destruct mission as well. Most recently, he attacked Fidel Castro. And I know Fidel is a very polarizing and controversial figure. I don't know what your views are. I know the left are somewhat divided. But again, I think that divide, again, comes down to that distinction between liberals and socialists. I don't believe many socialists would look badly upon Fidel and the Cuban regime. Whereas I think liberals certainly do have disdain towards him. But what are your views on Cuba?
I think Cuba itself, like you say, Castro he played an incredible part in bringing up education, bringing up the literacy levels, the things he did for Africa as well, during the apartheid period. I mean, if you look at him on a global scale, he had some really admirable traits. I'm not saying that the man didn't come with his problems and didn't come with his flaws, but then at the same time, for a world leader, for a leader of a country to oppose imperialism and to survive the 300 odd attempts on his life by the CIA, for me is an incredible feat. And there's a lot that you can learn from someone like that. And I think that is what I take from a lot of these characters, is what can you learn, as opposed to trying to create this sense of idolatry that I think is dangerous anyway. And I've kind of spoken about it in better detail in other places, but yeah, I think that's kind of where I sit with the good Castro, God rest his proverbial soul.
What I think is interesting with Fidel is that you can almost, and the Cuban regime, his detractors can fit into two sentences everything that was wrong with Cuba. If you were to do, but if you ask a question, compared to what? If you were to create a list of all the atrocities executed by America and England, you definitely would need more than a sentence to do that. So I think a sense of proportion is necessary there. And if we go on to the achievements of the Cuban Revolution, we talk about a country which was essentially, I think, had a staggeringly high illiteracy rate that was essentially eradicated. And
health as well, the health system.
They have 40,000 doctors in Cuba right now, another 20,000 medical students. They've educated over 80,000 doctors from other parts of the world. They've sent doctors to other parts of the world. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, Cuba offered to send 1,610 doctors, and the American government declined essentially, allowing their own people to die.
Well, the Cubans sent the most amount of aid out of any other country in the world. Yeah, and the quickest as well.
Yeah, and Cuba played an integral part in Angola, which essentially brought about the end of South Africa's apartheid as well. So Nelson Mandela, one of the first people that he went to see upon his release was Fidel. But that's the side of Cuba that they don't want you to see.
To talk about.
Now, and I agree with you that it hasn't been perfect, but name me a country that is.
Exactly. And that's what I think is, for me, it's a cheap shot when right-wing countries, capitalist countries, neoliberal countries, when they aim to try to take something away from systems. I mean, even the word regime, to call it, I think that terms like that are incredibly problematic. To call a Cuban regime, because obviously the connotations that are attached to a word such as a regime, you think of fascism and things like this. And even within that language and within the imagery that it invokes, it's a very Western way of looking at something like that. So I think, it's a cheap shot and it's completely reductive.
And typically the opening segment would say that the Cuban dictator, so it's already coloured the judgment of the person listening. But could you not quite, again, I come back to compared to what, could you not quite easily classify Obama and Blair, not as dictators, but there's other choice words you could use to describe some of the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, I definitely think Blair would, for me, he's a despot. I would classify him as a tyrant, as somebody who was responsible for a lot of carnage around the world and a lot of death. So I think there's no other real way you can kind of talk about Tony Blair and think about him in those lines. As somebody who is trained in law, who has a love of language and a way of using language, how do you feel that the way in which language the way in which we use language now on an everyday scale, how do you feel that it's kind of moved from where it might have been 20, 30 years ago with regards to the way in which idiom is used and vernacular and things like this?
Well, it depends. On the one hand, you could say the truncation of language constitutes just the evolution of language. So, for instance, text or abbreviations or everything like that, maybe that's not an erosion of language. Maybe it's just the evolution of language, or maybe it's displacing this monolithic idea of language. So that has, I suppose, to do with relativism as well. In an increasingly globalized world, it's a realization not everybody's going to speak the same, not everybody's going to sound the same. And perhaps it shouldn't be, for want of a better word, a privileging of a certain way of speaking.
And within this, I guess, the dialectical element of language and the way in which we use words, is there... I mean, I have very strong views about when people say certain words are exclusionary. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there is an element of that in there, and that we have to censor ourselves? We have to kind of shape our arguments and our speech to suit particular audiences, or should we be encouraged to use maybe more obscure words, more archaic words, more complex words? Is this something that should be encouraged generally?
Yeah, I definitely have this tendency, I think, to censor myself, and I think there is a bit of a suspicion, if you like, for wordsmiths. I actually heard Stephen Fry having to defend himself, saying, just because I put words together well doesn't mean I'm wrong. Mm. So I think there is this idea that if you're being articulate, sometimes it's to mask the fact that you're not actually saying anything particularly profound. Right. But, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true of some people. But there does seem to be a kind of a reluctance sometimes for... I mean, I don't know about you. Do you feel the need to censor yourself, or do you feel the language you use is exclusionary? Because it depends how people interpret what you're saying. Some people might say, well, I find that an interesting way of phrasing things. I want to know what that word is. So it actually serves to encourage people to speak. Other people might think, this guy is full of himself. He's just using big words to make me feel subordinate.
Exactly, and it can come across as pretentious, it can come across as alienating. But, I think that for somebody who reads and writes poetry and books and whatever else, you are in the business of language. Like, that is your vocation. You have to take it seriously. And I don't think there's anything wrong in acquiring language and using it in maybe more interesting ways, more creative ways, more expressive ways. I think that's absolutely fine. And Jimi Hendrix didn't become Jimi Hendrix by just playing the A, B and C chord. This is something that people have to constantly think about. However, depending on who you talk to, that I feel it's the job of the conversationalist to be able to construct arguments and sentences and sentiment using a language that is able to connect and resonate. Otherwise, you might as well just talk to the brick wall.
I think it comes back to what we were speaking about earlier about class as well, this idea that if you think of somebody like Russell Brand, right, he does constitute a rupture to reality, because there is this perception that somebody from a working class background shouldn't be able to string those words together. Now, a more discerning person might say, this guy it's just verbal pyrotechnics, nothing really going on there. But I think as well, I wonder if that plays into it, this sense of know your place.
Yeah, absolutely, and know what you're allowed to have access to. And interesting words, multisyllabic words, polysyllabic words are not one of those things. You have to stay talking in this very strict, general, commonplace way. And I definitely feel that. And maybe one of the things that working class, me and you both come from working class families where literature wasn't something that was kind of given to us. We had to kind of discover it on our own. So I think maybe we're rebelling against that, which is what causes this propensity for verbosity to an extent, because we're trying to prove a point. When I mean me, I don't mean me and you. I mean the people that come from similar worlds.
I suppose when you enter into different worlds, I mean, there's a canon of vocabulary that you require, depending. So in the poetry world, there's going to be words that most people are not familiar with. In the legal realm, if you go into medicine or even accounting, there's certain words which people acquire. So I think that's where the rupture comes. You start with this position, but it's constantly going to evolve.
Louis, thank you very much for talking to me today. Is there any way that people can follow you or find out what it is that you do?
No.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Louis.